Theodore Robert Bundy entered the world on November 24, 1946, born into confusion and secrecy. Raised to believe his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents, his early years were steeped in deception. That disorienting start would prove hauntingly prophetic for a man who became one of America's most deceptive and lethal predators. Behind his polished smile and preppy charm, Bundy harbored a darkness that simmered quietly beneath the surface. By the early 1970s, his appetite for control, dominance, and violence had grown insatiable. He didn't appear threatening, quite the opposite. With his clean-cut looks and articulate speech, he navigated social circles with ease, cloaking his monstrous nature beneath a polished facade. Bundy's early adult life was spent in the Pacific Northwest. He was a psychology student at the University of Washington, ambitious, politically involved, and even worked at a suicide prevention hotline. The very thought that this man once talked people down from the brink of death is a chilling irony, considering what he would soon become. Women were disappearing at an alarming rate. The trend began with little fanfare, but patterns eventually formed: young, white, attractive women with long dark hair parted in the middle. They vanished from college campuses and nearby neighborhoods, often during daylight, with little trace. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, no blood. Just silence. Bundy's method was methodical and terrifying in its simplicity. He would wear a fake cast on his arm or walk with crutches, pretending to struggle with carrying books or loading a sailboat. Women, often empathetic and unsuspecting, stopped to help. In a moment, their trust became their death sentence. Once close enough, he would strike, usually with a blunt object, rendering them unconscious before binding them and transporting them to secluded locations. That's where the true horror began. His victims suffered greatly. The violence wasn't brief or impulsive. It was extended, deliberate, and sadistic. Bundy enjoyed exerting absolute control. He raped them, killed them, and sometimes kept their bodies for days, returning to them to commit more unspeakable acts. His compulsion was driven not only by lust, but by a grotesque need to dominate completely, to reduce his victims to mere objects for his pleasure. The police struggled to keep up. In an age without surveillance cameras, DNA analysis, or centralized databases, Bundy exploited every gap in law enforcement's capabilities. He frequently crossed state lines, abducting women in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. Each jurisdiction had separate investigations, and the dots remained tragically unconnected for years. Meanwhile, Bundy maintained his double life with disturbing ease. He dated women, attended law school, and even volunteered for political campaigns. His ability to mimic normalcy was more than disturbing, it was genius-level manipulation. The very traits that should have signaled danger, charm, confidence, intelligence, became his best tools for luring victims. In 1975, Bundy was finally arrested in Utah for evading police during a traffic stop. A search of his car revealed handcuffs, a ski mask, a crowbar, and a set of women's underwear. It was clear something was terribly wrong, but proving it was another matter. Despite mounting suspicion, concrete evidence eluded prosecutors. He was convicted only of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to prison. But Ted Bundy was far from done. In 1977, he executed a daring escape from a Colorado courthouse library. Left alone and unshackled, he jumped from a second-story window and vanished into the snowy wilderness. Recaptured 6 days later, he would escape again just months later, this time by soaring through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell. By the time anyone noticed, he was already on a Greyhound bus to freedom. Bundy resurfaced in Florida, now a fugitive, and his descent into depravity only deepened. What followed was perhaps the most horrifying chapter in a life already drenched in blood. After vanishing from a Colorado jail in late 1977, Ted Bundy fled east, changing his appearance and identity along the way. The escape wasn't just about avoiding prison, it was an opportunity to start again, to indulge his urges without restraint. He arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, under the name Chris Hagen, broke and unstable, but driven by the same dark compulsion that had fueled his earlier crimes. Settling into a boarding house near Florida State University, Bundy kept a low profile. He stole what he needed to survive: food, credit cards, and IDs, slipping through life like a shadow. But the monster within him couldn't be silenced for long. The fantasy had returned, stronger than ever, and this time he wouldn't limit himself to isolation or calculated abductions. He would kill in the open. He would make a statement. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house through a back door that had been left unlocked. Armed with a piece of firewood, he crept silently from room to room, and within just 15 minutes, left a trail of devastation that stunned even seasoned detectives. Margaret Bowman, 21, was the first. Bundy bludgeoned her with such force that the firewood snapped. He then strangled her with a pair of pantyhose until her breath was gone. Next was Lisa Levi, 20, who suffered similar blows to the head. But Bundy didn't stop there. He bit her repeatedly, leaving deep impressions in her flesh, and sexually assaulted her with a foreign object. The violence was grotesque and frenzied, unlike the cold, calculated murders of his past. After attacking Bowman and Levi, Bundy moved through the house like a ghost. He entered 2 more rooms, brutally beating Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, both of whom survived the assault but suffered traumatic injuries. Then, without a word, he slipped out into the night. Bundy's rampage wasn't over. Just blocks away, less than an hour later, he broke into another home, this time targeting Cheryl Thomas, a young dance student. She was beaten so badly her jaw was shattered, her skull fractured, and she lost her hearing permanently in one ear. Bundy left behind little evidence, only a vague sense of terror that blanketed the college town like a storm cloud. The brutality of the Chi Omega attack drew national attention. The savagery, the random nature, the sheer boldness, it was unlike anything law enforcement had seen from this killer. The bite mark left on Lisa Levy's body would later become a key piece of forensic evidence, but at the time, authorities still had no idea they were dealing with Ted Bundy. In the weeks following the sorority house attacks, Bundy remained on the move, stealing cars and drifting from place to place. He grew thinner, more erratic, increasingly disconnected from the suave, self-assured persona he had once carefully maintained. His killing, however, was far from over. On February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach vanished from her middle school in Lake City, Florida. Witnesses remembered seeing a suspicious man lurking nearby, a stranger who didn't belong. Her body would later be discovered in a remote pig shed, raped and murdered. It was Bundy's final known victim, and one that revealed the full breadth of his depravity. No longer were his victims limited to young women. Now, even children weren't safe from his twisted desire for domination. Just a week later, on February 15, Bundy's luck finally ran out. Driving a stolen Volkswagen Beetle in Pensacola, he was pulled over by a suspicious patrol officer. At first, he gave a fake name, but after a scuffle and arrest, fingerprints revealed his true identity. The man behind one of the most extensive manhunts in American history had been caught once again. This time, there would be no escape. Back in custody, Bundy quickly realized Florida wouldn't be as forgiving as previous jurisdictions. The evidence was mounting: bite marks, eyewitness accounts, stolen credit cards, hair fibers, all tying him to the Chi Omega murders and Kimberly Leach's abduction. Though he continued to protest his innocence, the facade was beginning to crack. Yet even behind bars, Bundy couldn't resist the spotlight. He relished the media frenzy, often appearing confident and smiling in front of cameras, behaving more like a celebrity than a criminal. He insisted on representing himself at trial, turning the proceedings into a grotesque theater of ego. Bundy was no longer just a killer, he was a performer, and the courtroom became his stage. The trial for the Chi Omega murders began in June 1979, and it was the first in U.S. history to be nationally televised. The prosecution laid out the gruesome details, and the defense could do little to counter the avalanche of evidence. Bundy's charm had lost its power. The mask was slipping. Jurors were horrified not just by what he had done, but by how easily he had done it. In July of that year, Ted Bundy was found guilty of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. A second trial followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, ending in another conviction and a second death sentence. Still, Bundy refused to go quietly. Condemned by 2 Florida juries and sentenced to die in the electric chair, Ted Bundy didn't descend into despair as some might expect. Instead, the convicted serial killer began his next act, one that was less about repentance and more about manipulation. Death row didn't break him. It became his final stage. Bundy arrived at Florida State Prison in 1980, sentenced twice over, once for the brutal Chi Omega murders and again for the abduction and killing of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He was kept in a 6-by-9-foot cell on death row, where time moved differently. The isolation was oppressive, but Bundy found ways to keep himself engaged. He studied law, wrote letters, and developed a growing network of supporters, people who saw in him what they wanted to see: a misunderstood genius, a wrongly accused man, or simply someone famous enough to worship. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Bundy never stopped trying to manipulate public perception. He gave interviews to psychologists and journalists, each time offering just enough to remain relevant without revealing the full scope of his crimes. He spoke in riddles, occasionally admitting to mistakes while refusing to take full accountability. The truth, he knew, was power, and he hoarded it carefully. While awaiting execution, Bundy became something of a spectacle. True crime was entering the public consciousness in a way it never had before, and Bundy was at the center of the storm. Books were written. TV specials aired. The American public couldn't look away, fascinated and horrified by this smiling killer who didn't fit the mold. He was articulate, clean-cut, and intelligent, traits that made his crimes even more chilling. The mask he wore had been convincing, but by now, everyone knew what lay beneath it. Still, he held on to one last hope: the appeals process. Bundy used every trick in the book to delay his execution. He filed motions, changed legal representation, and exploited technicalities in Florida's capital punishment laws. He stalled for years, arguing his right to life while never granting the same to the dozens of women and girls he had destroyed. Behind the scenes, Bundy began using a new tactic: confession as currency. In the mid-1980s, he started hinting that he might know something about other unsolved murders. He spoke in the third person, describing how someone might have committed certain crimes. Investigators from multiple states came to speak with him, hoping to close cold cases. Bundy offered details only the killer could know, but he always stopped short of giving the full truth unless he saw a benefit for himself. As his execution dates came and went, each postponed through legal maneuvering, the families of his victims suffered anew. They watched in frustration as the man who had taken so much continued to live, sheltered behind concrete walls and legal red tape. For them, justice had a face, and that face kept grinning back at them from courtroom cameras and magazine covers. One of Bundy's more infamous death row moments came in 1982 when he married Carol Ann Boone, a woman who had been one of his most devoted supporters. During the penalty phase of the Kimberly Leach trial, Bundy proposed to her in open court, exploiting a quirk in Florida law that recognized courtroom declarations as legal marriages if made before a judge. Boone, unfazed by the nature of his crimes, accepted. The two shared conjugal visits, and she later gave birth to a daughter, rumored to be Bundy's. Eventually, even Boone would distance herself from him, realizing too late the man she believed in was a manipulative predator to his core. By 1988, the clock was finally ticking louder. Bundy's appeals had begun to collapse. The courts had grown weary of his stalling tactics, and the political climate in Florida was turning. Governor Bob Martinez signed a death warrant, setting an execution date for January 24, 1989. For the first time, Bundy appeared rattled. His charm, which once held entire rooms spellbound, no longer seemed to work. The mask was crumbling for good. In the final months of his life, Bundy changed tactics again. Facing certain death, he began to confess, fully and finally. He met with investigators from several states, recounting the details of murders he had denied for years. He admitted to killing women in Oregon, Washington, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. He described abductions, methods of disposal, and moments of monstrous clarity. Each confession was a piece of a puzzle that had haunted families and detectives for over a decade. He told stories of revisiting crime scenes, of sleeping beside corpses, of decapitations carried out with chilling nonchalance. He revealed how he lured victims with fake injuries, impersonated authority figures, and used their trust against them. His calm, clinical tone made the horrors he described even more disturbing. Some of his victims' names were already known. Others were not. Bundy claimed responsibility for 30 murders, though investigators believe the real number could be significantly higher. As he spoke, he seemed less concerned with atonement than with control. Even in his last days, Bundy wanted to dominate the narrative, to decide how much the world would know. On the eve of his execution, Bundy sat down for a final interview with psychologist Dr. James Dobson. In a last-ditch effort to deflect blame, Bundy blamed his descent into violence on an addiction to violent pornography. The claim was met with skepticism and outrage. The public wasn't interested in excuses. They wanted closure. Outside the prison gates, the mood was electric. Crowds gathered overnight, holding signs, playing music, even chanting "Burn, Bundy, burn." For many, this wasn't just the end of a killer, it was the culmination of years of fear, grief, and unanswered questions. Bundy had terrorized an entire generation. Now, finally, the curtain was closing. At 7:06 a.m. on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was led into the execution chamber. He made no final statement. Strapped into the electric chair, his face pale and eyes empty, he awaited the jolt that would erase him from the world. Witnesses described the smell of burning flesh and the sight of his body convulsing as 2,000 volts surged through him. He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. Outside, the crowd erupted. People danced, honked car horns, and celebrated not just a death, but a form of justice they had long been denied. The face that once smiled in courtrooms and flirted with reporters was finally still. For the first time in decades, families could breathe. The nightmare had an ending. In the years since his execution, Bundy's legacy has continued to haunt the public imagination. Books, films, documentaries, and podcasts have dissected his life in microscopic detail. He has been portrayed by Hollywood actors, debated by criminologists, and studied by psychologists. The fascination endures, not because of what he did, but because of who he appeared to be. Ted Bundy shattered the myth that monsters look like monsters. He showed the world that evil could wear a handsome face, speak with eloquence, and blend into society with disturbing ease. He wasn't a lunatic screaming on a street corner, he was the man helping you carry groceries, the law student with a winning smile, the friend of a friend who just seemed a little too charming. That's what makes his story so terrifying. Yet beyond the mythology and media, it's vital to remember the true victims, the women and girls whose lives were stolen, whose futures were erased, whose families were left to pick up the shattered pieces. Their names, too often eclipsed by Bundy's, deserve to be remembered. They were daughters, sisters, students, dreamers. They were not just victims of Ted Bundy. They were individuals with lives that mattered. Bundy's death did not bring them back. But it stopped him from taking any more. In the end, despite his efforts to manipulate the courts, deceive the public, and escape accountability, Ted Bundy met the same fate he inflicted on so many others, a violent, abrupt ending. His final moments were not on a stage or in a courtroom, but strapped to a chair, surrounded by the silence of the state and the roar of a crowd eager to see justice finally delivered. Thank you for listening to Echoes of Crime with Lewis. For more content like this, please like this video and subscribe to the channel.